Now, although we don't give them much attention, and we don't find them on our stained glass church windows, the Bible is full of women heroes who embody courage in the face of fear. Puah and Shiphrah are two of these women. They are midwives whose job was assisting mothers during the birth of their babies. Now, I birthed my babies at home with a midwife, and from my point of view, midwives have moxie and enormous compassion. When your midwife comes to your home and there's a bit of a chaos in the house, a hush comes over your house. The birthing pains may not go away, but the midwife's energy helps you keep the sense of expectation and joy. To understand today's women of faith, we will need to understand the context, what is the backstory here? The story begins with Joseph, the guy that we know of with the coat of many colors. Joseph was the favored son of Jacob, and he wasn't shy about letting his 12 siblings know about that special relationship that his father had for him. They lived in Canaan, and they were quite wealthy. Life was good for this large family who were descendants of Abraham. Everything seemed to be going well, except that jealousy thing between Joseph and his brothers. It escalated to the point that they sell him to Egyptian traders. Well, the long story short, and decades or so later, Joseph ends up interpreting the Egyptian pharaoh's dreams that prophesied that there was going to be a famine that would plague the whole world, and that one of the dreams explained how to prepare for the famine. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph, he made him second in command and put him in charge of the entire country of Egypt, organizing the whole country's preparation for the upcoming famine. After the promised 7 good years of rain and plenty of crops to store away, the famine hits. But Egypt is prepared. They have food in storehouses. However, all the countries around Egypt don't have food. Because of Joseph's leadership, however, Egypt becomes a food distribution point for the surrounding countries. Back in Canaan, Joseph's family is also experiencing famine. Father Jacob hears about the availability of grain in Egypt, and so he sends his 10 sons, to get grain for the whole family, along with all their servants and their servants' families and the livestock as well. Long story short again, after several trips to Egypt to purchase grain, and there's a lot of intrigue in this story, Joseph, the second in command to Pharaoh, tells his brothers one day as they come to him, "Hey, I am your long-lost brother, the one that you sold into slavery. It doesn't look like it. I have all this amazing, costume on, but I am your brother." Well, fast forward more. And if you want to read more about this story, I would just encourage you to go to Genesis, and right at the end of Genesis, put a Bible on your phone and sit and read it. It's very fascinating, and read it in the Message, and it will be easier to understand. So fast forward, where Joseph then one day tells his brothers that Pharaoh has given his blessing for the whole clan, everyone. Their servants, their families, and the sheep can all come and live in Egypt and settle in an area that is the most lush part of the country. But it was an area that was set apart from the rest of Egypt, out of the way part of the country. And so the Hebrew people, Jacob and his whole clan, become immigrants to Egypt. Jacob's clan grows, and they become a very large clan known as the Israelites. They pretty much moved to every corner of Egypt. The people of the society embraced them so much so that when Jacob, the father of Joseph, dies, the whole country of Egypt mourned him for 70 days. Years later, Joseph dies, and then many generations after that, there's a new Pharaoh that comes to power that doesn't know Joseph, or the part that Joseph played in saving Egypt from the famine. This Pharaoh doesn't understand why the Hebrew people are welcome to live in his country, nor does he respect their contribution to the Egyptian society. What was at one time a we relationship, a community of people from different ethnicities who worked together, doing life together, quickly under this Pharaoh becomes an us and them society. Have you ever been on that them side? Us and them. You know, when someone says them, those, they, watch out. They're on the other side of their the love circle. And so Pharaoh's hate and fear take over. And he begins the systematic process of what we call today ethnic cleansing. Some Bible historians believe that Pharaoh didn't really want to eradicate the Hebrew people. He wanted to strip them of their sense of dignity, self-worth, making them not just feel powerless, not just be powerless, but to feel powerless. They are too much to handle, Pharaoh said. They are now larger and stronger than us. We must figure out a way to contain them. They need to be managed. So Pharaoh and his team organized Joseph's father's descendants. The Hebrew immigrants who had been living in Egypt for many centuries now are put into work gangs, building buildings for Pharaoh. But the more the Hebrew people were oppressed, the more children they had, and their numbers grew. So Pharaoh makes a new policy. The work bosses were to treat the Hebrew men more harshly, putting them under inhumane work situations. Their numbers continue to grow. And that is when Puah and Shiphrah are brought into the king's palace. Puah and Shiphrah assisted all mothers, not just Egyptian mothers, but Hebrew mothers too, in birthing. They hear Pharaoh's decree to kill Hebrew baby boys upon delivery, but they resist the order. Eventually, they're caught, and the king calls them in. They give the king a subversive answer of defense. They play to his own stereotypes about the Hebrew immigrants and their breeding habits. These Hebrew women are like animals, they tell the king. They birth babies too quickly for us. My friends, sometimes resisting evil calls for civil disobedience. Sometimes a bit of subversion. This story is a great example how hate driven by fear can move a whole society to engage in genocidal acts. But this story tells us something else. It shows us how simple acts of justice can help bring about change. Puah and Shiphrah help bring about the liberation of the Hebrew people. But how do we resist a person or a group of people whose method of madness is driven by fear tactics? From my experience, midwives are pretty feisty people, but I have no doubt that they too experienced fear. Fear of what the Pharaoh would do to them when they disobeyed him. They took a risk, not just one time, but many, many times. And it's a good chance that they were not the only two midwives of all of Egypt, right? I mean, it's a big country. So they were like the head midwives, leading other midwives to do the same. Our scripture tells us that Puah and Shiphrah were able to do this because they respected and honored God. Their love for God was greater than their fear of their king. Our baptism and membership vows as United Methodists call us to renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness. When a baby's baptized, when there's new members, the pastor will ask them, do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness? Reject the evil powers of this world and resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? I have been asking that question many times now as a pastor, and it doesn't fail. Every time I ask that, there's a little voice inside of me that says, Mary, are you really a resistor? Do you think you're like, well, in this case, Puah and Shiphrah? Maybe you have that question too when that's brought up. I like to think that I am. I want to be. But when I think of social justice work that resist injustice and oppression, I often assume it involves raised voices and even fists that requires someone to lead and organize whatever is needed. Going to the streets, the slums, the villages, the inner city, and the State House to speak against policies. It calls us to give eloquent, powerful speeches, and I have to think, I don't think that's me. I'm not sure. In college, I marched on the Washington Mall in 1979. If you're interested in why I marched, talk to me later. My friend Candace and I were with a group of college friends. We were terrified. There were so many people, and the group we were with had a plan, what to do if things got, violent. That's it. And so that night, Candace and I went to our dorm room, and we were so relieved that nothing happened to us. So no, I'm not that type of resistor. Before moving west, I had the opportunity to visit the National Women's Rights Museum in Seneca Falls, New York, and was inspired by the stories of Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. These women were persistent in doing what was needed to be done to bring about equality. A lot still needs to be done to bring about equality. There's a lot of resisting that needs to be done today. Being silent and doing nothing will not bring about change. And yet, not all of us are a Sojourner Truth type, or even Puah and Shiphrah types. Last week, a book came out that made me happy and hopeful. It speaks to those of us who don't feel comfortable battling in the trenches. It's called Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul: How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. I haven't received my copy yet, but I read this review on the book. The reviewer says, because the activist ideal is so entrenched in our collective narrative, it can be difficult to visualize what an alternative looks like. And the author addresses this situation by telling a story from Star Trek. Anyone watch Star Trek? And especially the old one. The Star Trek actress Nichelle Nichols met Martin Luther King Jr. one day. And Nichols told him that she just felt horrible that she can't join Martin Luther King at the front lines of the ongoing civil rights marches. And she was pleasantly surprised when Martin Luther King responded with, "You don't need to march. You are marching." Dr. King went on to tell the Star Trek star that the show, Star Trek, is the only show he and wife allows his kids to stay up and watch at night. And they watch it because of this actor, Nichols. One of the only black women on television portraying a strong and brilliant leader, highly respected by all her colleagues in the show, whether they were white men or aliens from a distant planet. Nichelle Nichols' work as an actress, which at first might seem insignificant compared to the efforts of marching and sitting at lunch counters and registering voters, actually contributed meaningfully to the civil rights movement and social progress on a national scale. She didn't need to march in the streets. She was, as Dr. King said, already marching in her own way by showing an entire nation what was true and what was possible. Perhaps that is the question we need to answer individually and as a congregation. How do we march in our own way or act in our own way so that our neighbors know what is true and what is possible? Or to say it another way, how do we act so that all people can experience God's love and grace, so that all people are able to become the persons God is creating them to be? When I came through the congregation before worship started, I handed out this little square. If you received that square, you can hold it in the air. I don't think there are any more available right now, but if you received a square, I would like for you to write down a person that is for you this faithful type woman or man who has exhibited for you being courageous in times of fear, who steps out to help those who are on the margins of life. We have on the wall in the narthex a place that we will attach those little squares to. And if you didn't get a square, take one of those papers that's in front of you and write this name down and then put these into the offering plate as it comes by you. These people like Puah and Shiphrah and Nichols and Sojourner Truth and the person that you write down on your little paper help encourage us to live out our lives as resistors. Amen.